Today, I am very excited to host Ronnie Balog on the Rebecca Panapinto project. Ronnie is a managing director of Macquarie Asset Management's Portfolio Performance Group, where she leads a cross-functional team that is responsible for the identification and realization of value creation opportunities for a portfolio of companies. Previously, Ronnie was on Blackstone's portfolio operations team and led business transformation efforts to improve growth and profitability across the private equity portfolio. Ronnie has also worked in a variety of operational leadership roles across both the public and private sectors, also including time on General Electric's corporate audit staff. She's an Army combat veteran and a paratrooper who commanded in special operations. Fast forward to today, Ronnie lives in Florida with her sweet young daughter, Stevie, and she is actively involved in organizations that focus on organ donations, widow advocacy, and veteran entrepreneurship. Today's episode was especially impactful and emotional for me, so I can't wait for you to learn more about Ronnie's incredible story and this amazing impact she's making on the world. Enjoy the show. Yes, been looking so forward to this ever since we first met because your story is extremely interesting and really inspiring. I've loved getting to know you just over the short couple of weeks that we've known each other. So excited to showcase your life experience on my show today. Let's start at a very interesting point, though, because I believe you're the first person who actually has military background that I've had on my show. And I know that's such a huge, impactful way to really start out your career that I'm curious to hear from you during that experience. What did you learn about business and how did it really set you up for such a successful venture throughout your career?
So I started at West Point, which is the military academy. And at West Point, you really are working at being both a soldier and a scholar, as well as an athlete. So you have quite a bit of responsibility, both in terms of leadership, but also your own academic endeavors. So at West Point, you have to lead your peers, which is very challenging. You have somewhat of a authority, right, in terms of rank and position, but really you're trying to figure out the best way to influence your peers. And sometimes that comes from being friendly. Sometimes that comes from building rapport. Other times that comes from building networks and relationships that help you do that. So when I left West Point, I think I had a pretty good understanding of the challenges that come with leadership and especially peer leadership. And I went in to go to the 82nd Airborne. I immediately deployed to Afghanistan. And the amount of stress that you're under in a deployed environment is very, very difficult to even put words to. So I learned to operate in a high stress environment where your job as the leader is to really take that stress away from your soldiers and to make it as seamless as possible so that they can concentrate on their job and to reassure them that everything is going to be okay. I've always said the definition of leadership is really believing in people more than they believe in themselves so that they can find the best version of themselves. I went on to work in the Pentagon for a bit, and that was a really interesting experience. I worked on the Obama budget for Office of Management and Budget and Department of Defense. And I got to see at a strategic level how decisions in government and the military were made. So from the tactics of Afghanistan to kind of the strategy in the Pentagon. And that is something that very few individuals, I think at my age, got to see. And I would say it kind of perfectly sets you up for how a business runs, right? Between the strategic level, the operational level, and the real tactical level of how do you take strategy and policy and put it into action. And the challenges with people setting strategy and policies without understanding the needs of those at the lowest levels. I went on to be in special operations and eventually got out of the military and transitioned into General Electric's leadership program for military veterans. And what I found to be most helpful was that leadership experience, but also an understanding of how to set a plan and really execute a plan. And I always have a soft spot in my heart for hiring veterans, really because they can make things happen. They can get things done. And they tend to do it without a whole lot of complaint and a whole lot of pushback, which also helps.
And is that because of the experiences you're put in through the military that are such high stress and, kind of survival instincts that you really can't get rid of those? It sounds like even once you get in a career, they're kind of ingrained in you.
It takes a lot to rattle, I think, nerves of myself, certainly, but I think of most veterans, because most decisions in life are not life or death. And so when you come from that environment, it's just really hard to, it gives you a different perspective, I would say.
Yeah, especially in 20s early, like your brain is still forming and you're in these situations that, yeah, once it's what suit am I going to wear today is your biggest decision. You have a little bit of a understanding of like, yeah, this isn't that big of a deal.
So, like, the veterans have a different set of challenges in the workplace, which is it's hard to relate sometimes to peers who don't have that experience. And I recall being on the corporate audit staff for GE, and someone asked me to fix a PowerPoint at 2 o'clock in the morning, and my response was, "Why?" Right? No one's looking at this at 2 o'clock in the morning, and it's not a life or death matter. Why would I stay up and do this? And I think when people are really focused on climbing that corporate ladder, um, they prioritize things differently than you would if you had maybe a broader perspective.
Oh, that's super interesting. So was it in the GE role when you started to realize you're an operator? Because I
Yeah,
know you've said that you are an operator to your core. I'm curious when that realization came about.
different definitions, I guess, of operator, because in the military, operations is really kind of going out and running missions. And then in the business world, operations is just making things happen. I realized at GE, I worked across multiple different businesses. So I was in a program that really allowed for cross functional and really a global learning experience. I got to work in, Florence, Italy. I got to work in Paris. I got to work all around the world. And I think from there, I realized just what it takes to run a business, both from a financial standpoint, but probably more importantly, a leadership standpoint and being able to get things done. And like most large organizations, you really had to know who to talk to at GE to get things done. And I've found that to be the case in just about every business, which is like plans and policies and strategy is great, right? But how do you actually implement that change and measure success and ensure that you've actually achieved it?
You talk a lot about culture too, and how that's a big part of success in any company with people. In your experience of being in these different situations and even different countries, how do you gauge the temperature of a culture and maybe a situation you're walking into, especially when it's not as obvious as maybe a war zone is? It's just a corporate conference room. But how do you gauge what's really going on and what that culture is and how you should behave within that ecosystem?
It's an interesting question. I think culture is a bit nebulous and it means different things at different levels of the company. One thing that I always like to do is to talk to people who have recently left a company. They will give you kind of their take on what they think the culture is. I think you can examine the leaders who are at the top of the organization and what their backgrounds are. You can talk to key clients and understand what the client experience is and what clients think about the company culture. And then I like to say at the lowest man in the totem pole will always tell you the truth because he or she knows no better. So it's always helpful to just hang out in the lunchroom and hear what people are saying. I've learned more about different transformation programs, the success or lack thereof, from talking to people in the lunch line.
Well, I would think there's an element of not being, worried about risk or not having too much to lose. So why not be honest and yourself in that situation?
And it all comes down to how you treat people, right? How you treat
Mhm.
people. And I think though human beings tend to share information, and I think it's so important to treat people the right way. And
Mhm.
that will eventually come out in the company culture.
So then, as you've assimilated from military to GE, and now you've worked with Blackstone and Macquarie, and you're helping other companies to understand their operations, operationalize, and even drive innovation and digital transformation, where was maybe the biggest culture shock along that has then helped you really understand how to be super militant in your day to day now and bridge that gap between, your early career days to now you get in, you execute, and you turn around these companies so rapidly.
So I was a paratrooper in the military where you kind of infill, do your mission, and exfil. And that's essentially what I do today in the business world. And it has a lot of parallels, which is you have to have a very good understanding of what you're there to do. You have to have good alignment across the team. You have to be able to measure success and measure results. And then you have to be willing to get out, meaning let it run and actually integrate that change into the culture. I always ask people when I come into a company, how many of you have worked on a project that's gone more than 2 or 3 years? And everyone raises their hand. And then you say, does anyone remember what we started off trying to achieve? Most people don't. Uh, and I always look at status updates and I say, who here is guilty of doing a watermelon, green on the outside, but red on the inside, right? We're all on track. Everyone's nodding, but nothing's getting done. So there's programs like that in every organization. I think what's really important is to know what you're there to achieve, to have clear timelines and deliverables, very clear alignment, and what I call governance, which is ensuring the leadership, whether that be the board and the governance of the board or the executive team or an executive sponsor, really accountable for delivering those results. One way to do that is to bake that into people's objectives or into their bonus structure. Another way to do that is weekly or monthly or quarterly reviews where things are actually reviewed. And I think really just going back to the fundamentals of, are we getting the things done, achieving what we thought we were going to achieve? Uh, and eventually that will get incorporated into the culture, that level of accountability down to the lowest levels where people actually understand what is changing, why it's changing, and most importantly, what their role is in the change.
Well, and it takes a like brutal level of honesty that I've noticed in some cases, like you can't even expect that level of honesty with some people if they can't even be that honest with themselves. And so you're stuck at a barrier of like, if you can't be honest with yourself about the situation being bad or good, then I can tell you till I'm blue in the face that it's bad, but you don't care. And I can't get you to take action.
Radical candor is a principle that I live by. It's actually one of the aspects of the military that I call bittersweet, meaning like it's worked out really well in the military, in the business world, depending on the culture of a company. There's maybe a lesser tolerance to just have a very candid conversation. And ultimately, I think that comes from fear of like what happens if, right? And I always, within my own teams, try to create a culture where people can raise issues and you want to hear about the issues and you want to try to fix them together as a group. But going back to your comment on culture, it really depends on the culture of the company. I find it's difficult to really be successful unless everyone at all levels feels comfortable raising their hand to say, like, hey, we've got a problem here. And early in my career at GE, I worked on an ERP implementation, which is an enterprise resource planning tool. It's really a massive infrastructure project for the underlying technology of a business. And what ended up happening was the implementation went live. Just about every aspect of the business was negatively impacted. You could no longer do business. And when we went back to try to fact check and understand what happened, how did we get this so wrong? The answer was we knew. At all levels of the organization, people were putting their hands up to say, we're not ready for this, right? The proper planning hasn't been done, the proper training hasn't been done. And yet we went ahead anyway. Why? Because we had a go live date. Okay. So oftentimes in an organization, it's not that we don't know, it's that people aren't willing to make those hard decisions. And that's where leadership comes in.
Yeah, I've heard you say that your fear and hesitation of decision making has been severely just thrown out the window, that you can come in, make decisions, you'll know 60% of the information, but you just know that there is a painful consequence for indecisiveness. And I mean, in my career, it's always been I rather ask for forgiveness than permission. So when you're in that situation, is there still a barrier of knowing that 60% that you want to make sure you are confident in your decision? Or where does that balance come from, being willing to like come in, shake things up, but also not leave a trail of a mess behind you?
Yeah, I think it's a few things. One is if you have the ability to get more information, you do. So it's not always 60%, but most things will self-correct, meaning like if you make the wrong decision and it's not extremely impactful, I'm not saying like you go live on an ERP, that's a big decision, right? But most decisions are micro decisions that will self-correct. I think ultimately ensuring that you have the right balance between change and stability, if you will. Like how do you ensure that you still bring people along the way is really a function of getting the middle management and lower level leaders on board so that people feel comfortable at the lowest levels. And the day to day actually happens in the transactions, right? It's whoever's invoicing the customer, billing the customer, inputting an order into Salesforce. All of these things are really the micro decisions that are impacted. So you have to make sure that things are getting down to that level. And when there's a breakdown, it's almost always between kind of what the leadership thinks is happening and what is actually happening day to day.
So from what I'm hearing from you, whenever you come to, a first portfolio company with these groups that you serve, there's a ton of people to touch and talk to, and you're going to gain information even from, the person who's maybe just the intern even in the lunch line. So from your perspective, where do you start to get really set off from a really good perspective and feel like you build the most momentum, knowing that your time interfacing with that portfolio company could be very, very short?
So everything is kind of well thought out. You always start at the top, right? I think people like to believe that change can happen at grassroots levels, and I think that's aspirational. What ultimately needs to happen is change comes from the top. The tone is set from the top. And in the military, they say what gets done, what gets checked gets done, meaning that the leadership is responsible for what happens and what doesn't happen. So it's almost always a conversation with the CEO and the executive team to get the right level of alignment, and in some cases, the board, to ensure that there's the right level of governance and funding and commitment, because change is not fun. You asked previously about, how do you strike that balance between change and stability? It's really disruptive to a business. And so everyone has to go in with eyes wide open as to what it is that we're signing up to do. From there, I think you have to have a clear set of objectives. When you use words like transformation or digital transformation, it means different things to different people. And so you really have to be clear as to what it is that we're hoping to achieve for the business, for our customers, and for the day-to-day employee experience. And translate that so that people understand what it is that we're doing and why we're doing it. And then from having that set of kind of strategic priorities, understanding the projects, then the cadence of those projects, what's the timeline, and how do we measure success? How do we track success? But it has to start at the top. We often start with a CEO kickoff on what is the message that we are putting out, not just internally, but also externally as well.
Have you ever been in a situation where you realized pretty early on that maybe that CEO was the wrong CEO and had to react to that pretty quickly as well?
Absolutely. So leadership is probably the number, and talent are the number one things to get right in any sort of business transformation. So it's often challenging to convince somebody to do something really hard and commit to it if they don't want to be there. So I think ultimately the focus on talent, and this is all private equity firms and even in public companies as well, a lot of focus is spent on talent and making sure you have the right talent in place and that talent is committed to whatever project is underway. For example, there are some CFOs that are great in a steady state environment, but if you put them in an ERP implementation or a company that's ready to go public, that same CFO might not be the right fit. So it's a matter of assessing fit as well. It's not that you're the wrong person, it's you might not be the right role for you in this particular time in your career.
Right place, right time, or wrong place, wrong time, and better to fail fast on those situations.
Or wrong skill set, right?
Yeah.
Like I, in a steady state business, I'm probably not the best person to lead a steady state business. That's not what thrives me, right? Turnarounds and real transformational change is where I thrive. So it's just understanding as well in your personal brand what it is that you like to do and to play those strengths.
How do people find that out about themselves, especially like I was talking about earlier, where there can be a barrier of honesty with yourself? Do you encourage coaching? Do you encourage, you know, just exploring things in your hobby time? What does that look like?
I think you have to know what is fun for you. So I remember years ago, I was working at a professional services business and it just got really boring. I was doing the same thing day in and day out. And I thought, like, this just isn't fulfilling for me. And so I think when you start to get that itch where this isn't fun, this isn't fulfilling, you got to listen to it and figure out why. And then the inverse is true. If like there's something that's super fun to you that you don't mind, sometimes I would be up at 2 o'clock in the morning trying to figure out how to reconcile, a general ledger. And if you're willing to stay up that late to try to figure something out, and you're really not because you have to, because you actually want to, that's showing you what your highest level of excitement is. So I encourage people to think about what really gets you excited. What type of projects get you excited? What types of businesses get you excited? I've talked to people who say, like, I only want to work in tech companies because of the amount of innovation and creativity and the ability to scale. Right? It's very difficult to scale an industrial company. You can only make so many widgets. But like a SaaS company, a few lines of code and you might have a very different product. So I think it's understanding what it is that really, really excites you.
Speaking of things that excite you throughout your career with all these different companies that you've served, what is a business or a transformation that stands out to you as one that like you were excited every day to get out of bed and go serve that company?
So I worked with a company called ServPro while I was at Blackstone, and it was during COVID. And I started working with them before COVID, but ServPro does water mitigation and cleanup. They also had a commercial cleaning business. And during COVID, we actually set up a whole arm of the business focused on COVID cleanup. And the employees of ServPro were really responding to a global pandemic, cleaning up hospitals and nursing homes and different corporate organizations, and really were heroes. And I think that was super touching. It was great to be a part of. But one of the things that we were working on in the business at the time before COVID was, how do we set up new revenue streams? How do we look at the ability to respond to different types of emergency events? And as life would have it, we had the opportunity to do that very rapidly. It was very successful. The leadership of ServPro couldn't have been better. I mean, it was the greatest team to work with. In fact, the CEO at the time let me stay in one of his homes. So I was living outside of Nashville. It felt like a military deployment, and we were really helping people while transforming the business of ServPro. So I think that was one of my favorites.
Very cool. I'm familiar with them actually from Nashville. I'm like, where do I know that name? It was from Nashville Ties as well. Now, we talk about setting strategic priorities and understanding gap analysis, especially when you're talking to these companies and when you're starting early on. Assuming you have a CEO that's ready to engage, ready to be there and come to the table with that, then what is the next point of reference to be able to make sure that you're headed in the right direction? Is it a new revenue stream? Is it employee engagement? Where do you see, as far as almost like a hierarchy of needs, that the next state of approach and focus within a business needs to be once you've got a good baseline for where culture is headed? And obviously, it's a business that's healthy enough to now be able to think strategically.
So in private equity, when you buy a company, there's always a thesis. And that thesis involves, how are we going to grow this company? How are we going to make it more profitable? And what is it going to take to get there? So when we look at a company, we do something called due diligence, and we actually underwrite that into the thesis. So going in, there's a pretty high level set of assumptions around what it is that we hope to achieve in a business. Then the hard part becomes operationalizing that, sitting down with a CEO and cascading that into a set of priorities. Almost always, there's a look at cost efficiencies. How do we do this better, faster, cheaper? Sometimes that's outsourcing and looking for ways to kind of cut costs. Sometimes that's reorganizing from maybe local models to more centralized models in how we work, changing the way that we work. And other times it's building new products, going into new markets. So it can be a variety of different plays that you run. Going into the company purchase, though, there's a pretty good understanding of what that thesis will be. And I always like to include the leadership team in those conversations because they're ultimately going to be responsible for delivering that. So I guess the answer is, it depends. There's lots of different plays that you can run, and not all plays work in every type of company. If you have, for example, a very close customer base at the local level, centralizing your sales or centralizing your customer service might make a lot of sense on paper, but in reality, you're going to lose some of your most precious customers. So everything that you do has to be considered within the context of the company. And I always encourage both investors and management teams to consider that, when we move forward with a transformation plan, is what are the second and third order consequences? And what are the consequences to the local community as well? And how does that impact, potential jobs? How does that impact overall customer base? So you have to look at things individually within the context of the company.
I love that your answer is the business thesis, though, and not a new website or a new logo. Because so many times, so many companies get stuck on that, or even like I think it was Walmart just recently released their new logo, and it's like hardly any changes that they spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on, and it does nothing to drive the business forward. It's almost comical, like this is the new logo, but some companies just get so lost in that stuff.
I told you I'm an operator. I'm not a marketing person. I've always kind of gone after marketing and cost efficiency projects. But I think ultimately, marketing has its and brand has its purpose, particularly when you are a larger brand. But I always say focus on what matters, what's going to move the needle. And the 80-20 rule applies to most things in life. Like, where do you put in 20% of the effort and get 80% of the results? That might be the logo, but that will only be the case if you're already a pretty advanced company.
Well, we know today AI is like the new hot thing. All the new startups are AI, AI, AI. That's the future. But from your vantage point and the companies that you serve, I'm curious where you think the next exciting innovations and places to focus from a business perspective are that probably isn't going to be AI. It's going to be other areas where maybe AI is a part of it. But I'm just curious, as you're especially consulting with these companies and really getting in the weeds of how they service customers, what are areas of investment and priority over the next 2 years that you're driving them towards that are actually going to be worth their time investment?
I think it all goes back to what are you hoping to achieve? The buzzwords change every couple of years. I implemented robotics process automation years ago at GE, and at the time, we were telling people that this is the most innovative technology. It's going to replace all of these jobs. And if you look at what bots can do, they can do great things. Don't get me wrong, but it's really a scalability play. You're not, replacing massive amounts of headcount, at least not yet. So I think what a company needs to understand is, what are we hoping to achieve? Is it really a cost efficiency measure? Is it an enhanced customer experience? And then what tools are available to do that? And there's lots of tools on a spectrum. Transactional activities like doing account reconciliations fit well with something like robotics process automation. If you look at a call center and what we can do now with language models and AI in a call center, we can predictively understand why Rebecca's calling in, right? Based off of her recent activity on her phone or on the website or even a recent outage. So what the end state there is, we're looking to enhance the customer experience, not we're looking to implement AI. So I always tell people to understand what it is that we're hoping to achieve, and then look at a toolkit, not necessarily one particular application or even an application in a particular area, from kind of transactional type tools all the way through to cognitive computing and understanding what tool fits best. Now, that's with the context that you have the right talent in place that understands what those tools can do and which tool best to use and can maintain that. Oftentimes in these digital transformations, there's a bit of friction between the business owner and the IT department, and now even in some cases the digital department, right? So you have lots of different stakeholders: who's selecting the technology, who's implementing the technology, and who's using it day to day, and then who's responsible when something breaks, right? So I think ultimately it comes down to having the right people in place, understanding the business processes, and most importantly, what were we hoping to achieve with this tool. I would tell companies to take a step back and understand their underlying infrastructure, understand what it is that they're hoping to achieve over the next 3 to 5 years, and then look at where best to invest any sort of tech dollars.
Do you encourage folks to have these elements of research and decisions time bound so that they don't kind of lose time or get stuck in a cycle of indecisiveness as well? Like, hey, if you want to head down this path to accomplish this outcome, it should be sub 6 months. I'm just curious if you have an idea around suggesting time bound situations in certain scenarios with these companies.
I always recommend that the board is involved in terms of helping decide how much should be invested in over what period of time to ultimately hold the executive team responsible for delivering that. Now, depending on the baseline, right, of where you're starting from, you might be on a digital transformation for 3 to 4 years. In many cases, when you implement a new ERP, you don't see the business benefit to that for 3 to 5 years. And you could probably talk to a lot of companies who would say, even after 3 to 5 years, I don't feel it. So I think ultimately the time restriction really comes into play and to understanding your current state. But most importantly, it's having alignment with your board and your stakeholders as to what you're hoping to achieve over what period of time. And if things shift, understand why they shift. And I always encourage companies to kill programs that are not working, right? If you started off thinking that you are going to get some sort of efficiencies out of, doing something a different way, and you quickly realize that it's actually costing you a lot more money, both in the short and long term, right? You have to be able to look out and say, will we ever actually get to a steady state on this? It's okay to say, like, hey, this didn't work out as designed. What do we do? And this is where strategic partners come into play. A lot of different consultancies and a lot of different vendors have experience with like customers. It's important to go to industry conferences and talk to peers who have had similar experiences. I always find this helpful before something like an ERP implementation or a Salesforce, like a CRM implementation, is to connect leadership from prior companies to talk about the pains, because it does get worse before it gets better. And it's helpful to talk to somebody who's been through that and is on the other side of that. And this applies in all cases, whether it's transitioning a call center to a lower cost country, implementing a CRM, implementing an ERP or a new BI tool, pick anything. It's always helpful to talk to someone who has done it before and to understand their journey.
Now, Ronnie, beyond your super impressive career, you have this just incredible, heartwarming, and touching story throughout your personal life of basically things that have been given and taken away to you, and your approach and view on life throughout that. So, will you share a little bit with us about your journey through your marriage and your birth of your daughter?
Sure. I mean, I've had a crazy, crazy life. You couldn't make this up. I always say that Netflix couldn't write something better. But I lived abroad when I was 13 years old in Germany. I came back. I volunteered with veterans and decided that I wanted to go to the military, which was unheard of, really. My parents certainly weren't super supportive of that. I went to West Point. I graduated. I ended up in Afghanistan, then ended up in special operations, got out and went through the business world, and we chatted about that. I never thought that I was going to get married. Uh, for those of you who know my personality, it's probably not super shocking. Uh, During COVID, I moved to Florida and I met my late husband, Stephen Morose. Stephen was amazing. He was actually probably more incredible than I was. And I always said I would never settle down until I found someone who was just as remarkable. So Steve and I met. He was in finance, data science, and accounting and law. So he had more degrees than I can count. And we had our little girl. We got pregnant in last year. And in May, Stephen, we just told everyone that we were 6 months pregnant. And Stephen died very suddenly of a brain aneurysm. And we had just gotten home from telling everyone about this most joyous experience in life. And I mentioned that I've deployed. I know how to do CPR. I did CPR on Steve, but sadly, there was no reviving Steve. He had cardiac arrest with a brain aneurysm, which has a 0% survivability rate. I will say it was the most shocking thing I've ever seen play out in front of me, because he was a rower at the University of Pennsylvania. He was super fit and actually had worked out the morning that he died with really no symptoms. So at 44 years old, to just fall over dead is crazy. It really is. It's crazy. And in my mind, I guess I thought that there was like some sort of protection from the universe if you're pregnant. That is not the case. So in August, I gave birth to Stevie. I named her after Stephen, of course, and she is thriving. She's now about 5 months old, and yeah, so it was one of these things in life where you can't plan for it. There's things in life that just happen to us, and the reason I start kind of telling you at the early stages of where going to Germany and working in politics at a young age, and then going to West Point in the military, is that you can't ever understand what's happening next, right? And sometimes good things happen, and sometimes bad things happen. It's all in the context, and in the end, I think it ultimately all works out. And I would never expected one to get married, but certainly to find somebody as incredible as Steve. And I will say that I'm a pretty strong, independent woman. It takes quite the personality, I think, to kind of sweep me off my feet. And he was everything. And I never expected it. And it was such a joy to have. And likewise, I never really expected to be a mom. And Stevie, she has swept me off my feet. And except for a few late nights, she keeps me smiling. So I think that in life, there's just things that you can't really plan for, good and bad. And you just keep taking it.
Amazing. Gosh, you got me going. Very emotional story. And I love that he left you this precious gift in your little girl. It's pretty awesome. Um, so you're an inspiration. Thanks for sharing that. And
Yeah.
I just love to see now today, even how you like she's 5 months old and you've picked up and you want to go change the world and you want to help widows as well. So tell us a little bit about that passion and how you've turned this tragedy into something that you're using to just go and make other folks' lives better.
So when I got into the business world, it was apparent there was a lot of stereotypes against veterans, especially combat veterans. When I started, people would ask me, "Did you kill people? Do you have PTSD?" People ask a lot of questions, and I think many veterans are at a disadvantage in terms of getting the opportunities to really excel in their careers. So I said, when I get to a point where I can hire veterans and help, I will. And so in every organization that I've worked in, I always look to hire and help veterans and their spouses. There's a group called Insta Teams that helps military spouses find work. So I've always been an advocate for veterans and ensuring veterans have equal opportunity. And when Steve died, I connected with other widows. I was looking endlessly for people who were like me. There's not many young widows. It's less than 5% of widows are under the age of 40. But I reached out, and I there's just so many stories out there that are heartbreaking. And one of the things that I was very blessed to have is a career and an education and a background and financial stability. And that's not the case with many young widows. And I have one daughter. I have friends who have 8 children and no help. So I was amazed to find out that Social Security pays widows a one-time payment of $255. If that doesn't quite help. And there's not a lot of resources or nonprofits out there to really truly support people in need. When I got back from Afghanistan, there were so many different nonprofits that reached out. When I was ready to transition into the business world from the military, there were so many different nonprofits that reached out to help me with interviewing and job training skills and networking events. There's not a similar network for young widows. And I recently read Sheryl Sandberg's book, Option B. And I met Sheryl in 2018, and she gave me a signed copy of that book. And I am ashamed to say that it sat on my bookshelf unread until about a month ago. And in the book, Cheryl describes losing her husband, Dave, while they were on vacation to Mexico and they had 2 young children. And she talks about what you and I were just discussing, which is there's a real lack of support, community, network, and resources for young widows and widowers. And that is both in the community, in the government, and the social net, as well as in the workplace. Many people have bereavement leave of 2 or 3 days. And you can imagine what that would feel like having to go back to work. And if you're not able to work after 2 or 3 days, what that does to your financial stability and the fear that you have for your children. So it was something that I never planned to get engaged or involved in. I wouldn't wish this on anyone, but I do understand just the scope and the magnitude of what a problem it is and how it drastically impacts so many people.
Well, Ronnie, this has been such a pleasure. We've talked about so much of an adventure that your life has been. But I have one final question, and it's around principles. And throughout all of your life experiences, I'm curious to hear what has been the one guiding principle that's helped you be successful throughout business.
So there's a mantra that I have taken with me since I was a cadet at West Point on a rough march that I wanted to quit on. And it's always forward, never back. And in the military, they tell you to always move forward and never look back because you will stop, right? You'll get frustrated with yourself on the lack of progress. You'll get frustrated with, how hard it's been to achieve. But if you always look forward, right, that you'll keep a positive mindset. So I always encourage people, always forward, never back. You can't go backwards. You can only move forwards. And I think that has applicability in the business world, certainly in your personal life as well. It's how do you take what you've learned and move forward?
And how cool is it that you learned that so early on in your career so that you've just had this time to practice and really like have it become a part of who you are versus being something that's somewhat unknown and scary, but it's literally ingrained in who you are, so you're constantly ready for the next battle that is in front of you.
I always encourage people to have a mantra because it's easy to have one in good times. You need it the most in kind of hard times or challenging times. So I always encourage people to think about what that is for you and keep it no matter what.
Well, you're amazing. Absolute pleasure. Thank you for being with us today, Ronnie. And I'm so excited to release your story to the world.
Well, thanks for having me.